All of them.
Yeah. Pardon my French, fuck those fuckers.
A very wise man, me, once said a pessimist can only ever have a nice surprise. And it's true, you know, if you're always expecting the worst, then whenever anything goes even slightly right, it's a pleasant surprise. It's something genuinely nice, and it genuinely surprises you. Whereas an optimist is constantly and consistently going to be let down by the universe. Yeah, and I take my own advice to heart. I try not to get hyped about anything, because that way, almost always, lies disappointment. But The Boys is coming to Amazon Prime Video, and I fucking love The Boys. It is pure, distilled essence of Garth Ennis's work, if you know what he's done, you know, things like Preacher and so on. On the surface, it's all exploding heads and mangled genitalia and swearing, but under the surface, as with a lot of Ennis's work, there's a lot going on. Now, I'm not saying it's a hugely cerebral deconstruction of the superhero mythos and so on. If you want that, go and read Grant Morrison's Super Gods, or go and read the whole run of Planetary. Absolute Planetary is well worth the price, if you ask me. But in its own way, it does the same thing, while also being a much more visceral and entertaining read than some of these other things might be. But it does deconstruct a lot of it. It does pose the question, again, this is nothing new, it's been done before, but it poses the questions, what would the world be like if superheroes were real? Now consider the kinds of people in the real world who end up pulling the levers of power, the kinds of people who end up at the heads of corporations, the kinds of people that the government might choose for special duties or intelligence work or whatever else. And I think we can rapidly see that if there were superpowers in the world, there would be a hell of a lot more supervillains than there would be superheroes. Absolute power does indeed tend to corrupt absolutely, or those who want power and go for it are the people that should be denied it. So whether it's governmental or corporate groups handing out powers, or whether they're randomly distributed across the population, if it were real, you're probably going to end up in trouble rather rapidly. And the eternal question in a lot of more modern comics, I hesitate to use the word because it turns people off, but the postmodern or even the modernist realistic comics, you know, the big question is, who watches the Watchmen?
I got the boys together. Join us.
To do what?
Spank the bastards.
Who Watches the Watchmen is a great setup for a comic book series or a game or a novel, you know. Corruption amongst the people who are supposed to be the enforcers of order, you know, it's always a good story. It kind of appeals to our sense of righteousness and justice, while also sticking it to the man in some way. And the idea of a police of superheroes, you know, watching over that community, it's been tackled before, and it has been tackled with the same violence and cynicism that we see in The Boys, just not quite to the same kind of expansive extent, or with quite the same style and panache. I mean, Top 10 does it, but then in that world, everyone is a superhero. I think Immune Lass is a prostitute in that one for obvious reasons, and so on. Martial Law did it in a fantastic way, in my not so humble opinion, and that's well worth a read. The Boys does take a slightly different angle on the whole thing, though. Hopefully not too many spoilers here, because we don't know what's in the series yet, and I'll try and keep it to broad strokes. The boys is a very British phrase, right? It's probably also used in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, you know, other former territories, but it's one of those wonderful kind of vague, almost passive-aggressive British threats, right? Sort yourself out, or I'll have to send the boys round. The boys is like this non-specific force of nature. If you're involved in gangland, it might well turn out to be a bunch of East London guys in ill-fitting suits with crowbars come to smash your kneecaps in for not paying your debts. That sort of thing. It's a vague, almost kind of semi-mythical threat, which is why it's a great name for the group here. I hope they haven't Americanized the series too much. It looks like Wee Huey has been turned into an American. It's nice to see Simon Pegg, who Wee Huey was modelled on, being Wee Huey's dad, but they've turned him into an American, and it does seem like some other things have changed, which is good because it'll keep it fresh in the same kind of way that the Walking Dead series is fresh compared to the comics, because they make just enough changes and so on. But The Boys is a kind of clandestine CIA, vaguely, deniably affiliated group of people who either have certain powers but have reason to hate superheroes, or have been given them by this horrendously expensive kind of black book injection. They only really have the most kind of basic superheroic powers, like they're incredibly tough, they might be a little bit faster than normal, and they're immensely strong, right? But they work as a unit, and they're cohesive, and they hate superheroes, and that is what gives them their edge, and to an extent makes them incorruptible. So they're kind of more like the Untouchables in a way. You know, their personal tragedy, their backstory, whatever else, you know, that gives them that righteousness to take on corruption in the superhero community, and they are this kind of semi-mythical body. So when a superhero abuses their power and does something horrendous, what can the conventional authorities do? Nothing. So you have to send the boys round to sort them out one way or another, and they have the power and the intent and the willpower and the viciousness to see it through and spank them back into shape or take them out. And that's basically the premise. Now, if you are a giant nerd like me, then when you see something like this, your first instinct is, how can I put this into a role-playing game?
Lacing the shoes, I'm on the move. I got so much to prove.
It's suicide to go after the soups.
Superheroics presents a really difficult and interesting design challenge when it comes to RPGs. There have been many superhero role-playing games. The only ones that have made any really significant impact on the general sort of gaming consciousness have tended to be those tied to either the Marvel or DC properties. Now, the really big problem that you face in these games is the sheer breadth of power differential. Right? So if one person is playing Superman and another person is playing Batman, on paper, and really no matter how much preparation Batman has done, Batman is going to get kicked into the sun in like the first second of combat. Right? He stands basically no chance whatsoever against Superman. So how do you deal with that in a role-playing game which necessarily has mechanics? One route you can take is to go kind of on the super narrative kind of side of things, where superpowers are more like narrative effects, where you play to your character's strengths and so on. Taking the more heavy mechanical route doesn't tend to work unless everyone is operating on vaguely the same sort of level, right? Or you can reduce the deadliness, you can take it into a more sort of cartoonish level of violence, make it really hard, to kill anybody, and that allows the Batman versus Superman thing to work out on a more even basis. Marvel superheroes worked really well in a lot of ways for modelling the kinds of conflicts that we saw in the comics at the time, but less so once you got into the kind of 90s dark ages of comics. It kind of stopped working there. DC heroes had a really kind of interesting exponential statistic curve and kind of worked, but there really isn't any game that really does it hugely well because of these design issues. Still, I'm going to recommend to you 3 games, 3 superhero systems that I think could model The Boys pretty well if you wanted to run them as a game. Now, like I say, there are mechanical issues. There is going to need to be a lot of fudging and fiddling around if you want to bring this kind of stuff into a game. Now, there have been superhero games written for the kind of grittier superhero genre. The Authority kind of looms large as an example of a comic book series that took this kind of realistic approach, and ultra-violence and people getting their heads punched off or being beaten to death with their own spinal column, you know, that sort of thing. There was a game, Tristat, that was the system behind it, written for the Authority, but it doesn't work. The book feels rushed, the system doesn't properly represent what happens in the comics. You would think that would be a good call, but it isn't. So then, what 3 systems would Mr. Grimm recommend to you if you wanted to run The Boys in tabletop?
They just declared war.
In some ways, the setup of The Boys is a gift to you as a games master, because the suite of powers that the player characters have, or are likely to have, are all pretty much the same. A bit of superior speed, a bit of superior strength, a bit of superior stamina, and so on. The kind of boring, regular stuff, which leaves a lot more to stunts, perhaps, and player characterization, you know, the role in the play, rather than just being a suite of powers. It also allows you to open up what their opponents might have to anything. So balance is kind of less of an issue, because you know they're going to be able to take it, whatever it is that you're dishing out. That's what the characters are set up to do, and they'll have to use equipment and so on to and cunning and group tactics to make up the ground, right? So it requires a degree of intelligent play. So the system issues that cripple a lot of superhero games aren't necessarily as present if you're running a The Boys campaign. So first system, there's an old Mayfair game system called Underground. In a lot of ways it's basically a rip-off of Martial Law, which is an entirely different comic book series, but it would work reasonably well for The Boys. The background and premise and so on behind that you don't need to know so much, but it does cope rather well with the interaction of different powers and so on. It's quite a shallow but easily graspable system. The only problem that you'd have there is that equipment tends to be weak and pathetic compared to powers, so that might cause a certain compatibility issue, and there isn't a great deal of available granularity in the system to differentiate. I mean, the lowest sized handgun, if I remember rightly, in the game is something like a 50 caliber handgun, and that does the minimum possible damage, right? So that kind of tells you the problem there. So it would probably need a bit of tweaking, but it's kind of set up for that kind of game, so that would work quite well. Second choice, if you want to take a more narrativist spin on how to do this, would be the Marvel Cortex version. There have been many versions of Marvel superheroes games down the years, including a rather obscure diceless one that I have, and Phase Rip, as people call it. There's been lots of different versions, and there's been, you know, DC Heroes and stuff on the other side. But Cortex takes a more narrative approach that really helps you balance the Batman Superman issue. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but it can cope with pretty much everything, including the power differential. The only issue I would think you would find with it going into the kind of the boys situation is it's probably not deadly enough, and again there's probably not enough granularity there in the system to really represent the full sweep of things when it comes to equipment and so on. But if you want a more narrativist solution, if you file the soft edges of Cortex into sharp points, it should work reasonably well. Now my final recommendation, and the one I would definitely recommend the most, would be the Aberrant system by White Wolf. This is kind of an abandoned system. I think you can still get it on drive-through. I will see if there are links for downloads or whatever of all of these games and put them down below for you. Aberrant uses Storyteller, which is kind of graspable and visceral. A lot of people are familiar with it. It's not a particularly balanced system, but in this context that's not too much of an issue. There's stuff you'll need to strip out of it, but overall the suite of powers that are available in the basic book and the player's guide should give you everything you need, and there is enough granularity in the system, and there's a sweep of different strength, speed and toughness stunts that you could customize your characters while still remaining true to the boys. So we used Aberrant very successfully to run an Authority style superhero game. Worked incredibly well. I think it would work best for the boys. You just need to kind of up your descriptive flair a little to give it the deadliness and gratuitousness that you really need to represent Garth Ennis's work. You know, things like kicking someone's genitals up into their throat and then pulling their testicles through their nose. That's something you can do with a little narrative flair based on the damage that gets done, and Aberrant is going to work best for that. So that's my heartiest recommendation, would be Aberrant.
I know you're trying to be tough, but we're superheroes. Who are you?
And I'm so dirty, call me daddy. You're so sexy, you could be my bad girl. If someone hurt you and you tried to hide it, I'll cut you deeper, 'cause I know you like it.